Hey everybody, KMO here with another Out of My Head video. And last night I watched a good portion of the second night of the Democratic debates. This was the one featuring the two candidates I like best, Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang. The stream crapped out 3 times, and after the 3rd time I didn't bother to reestablish it. So I didn't catch the Joe Biden, Andrew Yang piece on climate change, where Andrew Yang was channeling every question, answering every question basically with universal basic income. And so how do you follow up Joe Biden talking about climate, with an answer that gets us back to universal basic income? And Andrew Yang basically said, climate change is a big deal, but it's a global problem. The United States emits 15% of the total carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So while we like to think of ourselves as the whole world and that, the response to climate change will be the one officially endorsed by the United States government, really there's going to be a lot of different approaches. And it doesn't matter so much what the United States does, because temperature will increase regardless of which policy we adopt. Ocean levels will rise and people will have to move away from the coasts. And let's give people the opportunity and the resources they need to adapt to this situation. Let's give them money. So here we are. We've gone from climate change back to UBI. That was his strategy. Now, the thing that he said that upset a lot of people is that we are 10 years too late. For what? He didn't exactly say for what. And here's the thing. I agree with his critics on this. Climate change impacts are not a yes or no thing. It's not a radio button that's either on or off. There is a spectrum of, climate change scenarios that differ depending on how much action human civilization takes, at what speed, and how effective it is in drawing down atmospheric carbon and doing other things to ameliorate climate change. So yes, his answer was too simplistic. He took something that is very complex with a lot of nuance and he boiled it down to a yes or no. Can we avoid the effects of climate change? No. It's too late. We have to adapt. Let's help people adapt by giving them resources. That was his point. I think a lot of folks, particularly on the left, folks at the Atlantic, folks at Gizmodo are anxious to run him down in favor of, their more neoliberal acceptable candidates. And so what did, we'll start with the Atlantic, because that was the first piece that I read, and it wasn't so hysterical. It made the points that I've just made, that, effects of climate change are not a yes or no, on or off sort of affair, that there is a spectrum of, potential outcomes. We have definitely waited too long to achieve the best case scenario. But we haven't waited so long that, it's still impossible to avoid the worst case scenario. So this is how Robinson Mayer at The Atlantic put it in his piece called "Andrew Yang is Not Your Climate Friend." So first he starts off quoting Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang said, "The important number in this is 15% of global emissions. We like to act as if we're 100%. Even if we were to curb our emissions dramatically, the Earth is going to get warmer. The last 4 years have been the 4 warmest years in history. We are too late. We are 10 years too late." So Robinson Mayer responds, "Okay, let's stop there. Yang is correct about a number of facts here. The United States does emit about 15% of the world's carbon pollution. Even if the US cut emissions now, the world would keep getting warmer. That would be true even if the entire world cut carbon emissions, by the way. The thing about filling the atmosphere with greenhouse gases is that they will keep mindlessly capturing heat until they are absorbed or dissolve. Yang is also right that some climate change is already baked in. The planet has already warmed by about 1 degree Celsius. Yang sees those facts collectively as a condemnation. We're too late, he intones. We're 10 years too late. With some due respect. What the hell? Yang has taken several nominally true sentences and strung them together into a dangerous argument. Sure, we're too late to avoid some amount of climate change taking hold. We will need to adapt to climate change, and frankly, few leaders talk enough about adaptation. Several candidates on stage last night, including Washington Governor Jay Inslee and former Vice President Joe Biden, have adaptation plans. But the game is not lost. The planet could still follow a range of emissions outcomes, including a not very bad one and a catastrophic worst-case scenario. The worst, fastest sea level rise seems like it may kick in between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius, and extraordinary action could yet hold that off. Nor is the United States' 15% share of global emissions reason for despair. First of all, the US is the second largest producer of carbon emissions. Second, there is a good response available to America's emissions, and Yang, a former tech worker, should know it. The United States must develop decarbonization technologies here that can be sold or transferred to the rest of the world. That is why so many candidates stress the importance of R&D, and why Inslee and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts have talked about green manufacturing. So I'll skip the part where he quotes Yang saying, we need to move away from the coasts. Move to higher ground. I've already paraphrased it for you. So Robinson Mayer continues, maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe Yang is just very good at staying on message. He is, after all, referring to his signature proposal, a universal basic income that would assure every American $1,000 a month. And sure, I guess. It is true, it is obviously true, that people who have more money will be less vulnerable to any one disaster, and people who are facing disaster should have more money. Protection from vulnerability is basically what wealth is. But handing out money is not an adaptation policy, and $1,000 a month is not a good response to losing your house to higher sea levels, which is the malady Yang seems to be implying. It is certainly not a collective adaptive approach to the challenge of climate change. And you know what? I'm not going to read the conclusion to this, but the bit that I just read, I agree with. Universal basic income as a first and only response to climate change is so inadequate as to be ludicrous. But Andrew Yang is not proposing it as the only response to climate change. Again, he was just staying on message. He was taking whatever question was thrown at him and finding a way to talk about universal basic income. Clearly, that's what he was doing. And while Robinson Mayer understood that, even acknowledged that he understood that, he then went on to respond as if he didn't understand it. But let's move from the Atlantic, which is pitched at New York Democrats, to Gizmodo, which is pitched at, and I won't even go and describe the archetype, you know who I'm talking about. We'll just say that they're younger and they don't read anything that isn't on a screen. So let's move on over to Gizmodo. Andrew Yang is the most dangerous Democratic presidential candidate, by Brian Kahn. So I can skip most of this because it's basically just setting the scene, which I've already done, and you get it. And so, like the writer for The Atlantic, Brian Kahn, writing for Gizmodo, acknowledges that some statements that came out of Andrew Yang's mouth on this topic were true. Now we'll get into the text. All this is based on good, sound science. And the takeaway to me is the U.S. needs to assume the mantle of global climate leadership and embark on a moonshot or World War II-style mobilization of technology, research, and human capital to avert catastrophic climate change. So, this is basically, yeah, technically it's true that the United States isn't the whole fucking world, but really the United States is the only country that matters when it comes to combating climate change. So, Brian Kahn continues. We are 10 years too late is the absolute shittiest climate messaging I could imagine a presidential candidate using. Yes, it's even worse than Donald Trump's brain-dead climate denial, which is transparently stupid, as opposed to Yang's veneer of science-backed wisdom. And then this author goes on to mention, with great emphasis, that Andrew Yang endorses geo-engineering. I didn't know that when I woke up this morning. But I, like universal basic income, I have been warming to the idea of geoengineering for a long time. And what does Andrew Yang have to say about it? Well, let's go to his campaign website. So on his website, Andrew Yang says, as president, I will invest heavily in carbon capture and geoengineering technologies designed to reverse the damage already done to the environment through a new global geoengineering institute and invite international participation. Invest in any idea that has potential to reverse the damage done to the environment, for example, cloud seeding technology to increase the atmosphere's reflectivity. end the current tax benefits and cuts given to fossil fuel companies, which give them an unwarranted competitive advantage over alternative energy sources. Institute a tax on emissions that will fund healthcare initiatives and research for respiratory diseases that are a direct result of these emissions. Empower and appoint an action-oriented leader of the EPA and direct the EPA to regulate carbon emissions. Direct the EPA to survey the states and private organizations to collate all programs designed to promote renewable energy adoption. Direct the EPA to coordinate with state and local governments to measure the impact of different policies on affecting positive impacts in these areas of renewable adoption. Prioritize sustainable infrastructure and urban development to take advantage of new materials and designs. So, according to the Gizmodo author, what I just read to you is worse than Donald Trump's denial that climate change is even an issue, that it's just a hoax created by the Chinese. Thanks, Gizmodo. And I'm not going to read it directly, but I was reading more about Andrew Yang's climate change proposals on his campaign website, and one of the things he says is that, look, we have to investigate geoengineering because somebody else is going to try it. You know, if we don't do it, that doesn't mean it's not going to get done. So before somebody else goes and does it poorly with horrible backlash, we need to start researching it right now and figure out what works and what doesn't. Essentially, he's saying, let's throw a lot of money into climate research, but with an emphasis on how we can affect climate. We're already doing geoengineering. We're just doing it blindly, automatically, haphazardly with our industry. Let's do it deliberately. So that's my argument for geoengineering. I'm not married to it. I've spent, a solid decade in the peak oil community where basically anything that isn't just planting trees is evil. And, I completely and totally reject that mentality. But at the same time, geoengineering is a complex topic, and I'm not boiling it down to anything simplistic. Any sort of bumper sticker slogan is going to be too simplistic for me to endorse. But I will say that I'm not categorically against geoengineering, and the fact that Andrew Yang says we need to put a lot of emphasis into researching this is in no way a deal breaker for me. It's not even a negative. I'm totally behind researching which methods of geoengineering are most likely to produce the outcomes we're looking for and figure out which ones are most dangerous and which ones can go wrong most easily and avoid those. All of this requires research, and that is what Andrew Yang is advocating on his website. And I think it just reflects very clearly the mentality of people who write for outlets like Gizmodo or BuzzFeed or, the family of websites I'm talking about. That mentality not only makes, the perfect the enemy of the good, but does so in just the most absurd fashion, saying that Andrew Yang's emphasis on research and his failure to categorically rule out geoengineering makes him worse than Trump's denialism. Come on. All right. Dead horse, sufficiently beaten. I will sign off and talk to you again tomorrow. Stay well.